Hey, what's up? I'm checking out my birthplace. Yeah, that's right. I was born right here in the middle of this parking lot. Check it out. Yep. Right here in the middle of this parking lot was the Lakewood Hospital. And we're standing right on top of where the maternity ward was. How do I know that? Well, the hospital was here for a long time, and I came with my mom to visit some ladies who had babies. But right here, this is where I was born. Now, in 1959, none of this was here. The big hospital was here. Right out front of the hospital, my dad was walking dogs while my mother was having me.
Luinator 59, Luinator 59, Luinator 59, you should follow Luinator 59.
Hi, I'm Luinator59. I've been working on this video for 5 days, and on Monday I spent the whole morning out shooting in Long Beach, only to come home and find that the footage was poo-poo. So today I took a suggestion from a friend in New Zealand, Hissing Thoughts on YouTube, and just go somewhere where I can just be alone with you and me, because I want my story to go on to my grandkids and their kids, and I want the story to live on because it's a really amazing story. Okay, now this is where I start to lose it, because I have all these things I want to tell you, but I just can't put it together. And we're going to start about who I am. And Luinator59. Luinator59 became my name. It all started when ExxonMobil wanted to take 5 jobs, 1 safety, 2 regulatory, and 2 environmental jobs, and make them into 1 job. When I was given my instructions and the rest of the company was told what I was going to do, they started looking at me and calling me the Terminator. Of course, I did like to wear big black glasses. Well, there was a picture in my office that I took in Las Vegas at the Harley-Davidson Cafe, sitting on a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and I brought it back and I put it in my office, and the word Terminator kept coming up, and they looked at that and then they started calling me Luinator, and 59 is the year I was born, so I threw it in together, Luinator59. In 1959, the President of the United States was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his Vice President was Richard Nixon. Alaska was admitted as the 49th U.S. state. The United States was just recognizing the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. A charter plane transporting musicians Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper goes down in Iowa. That day would be called the day the music died. Rod Sterling's classic had just came out. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS. 3 years after its telecast of The Wizard of Oz, they decided that they were going to make it an annual viewing for the American public. The conservatism which gripped the United States and the world came from these people who experienced the effects of 2 world wars, a stock market collapse, a Great Depression, and that's not to leave out an industrial revolution, an invention of radio and television, the creation of the first movies, and the birth of the greatest times of American history, which would shape our world. To say it best, America was apple pie, sports, family, and fun, and Americans knew that it was a struggle to save, invest, and look forward to achieving the American dream. Yeah, that's right. At one time, families had money in the bank. Truthfully, the American public was shaped into one of the most freedom-loving, tragedy-responding, missionary-sending, friendly countries. Yet America was waking up to truth that while they built their wonderful medium of television and radio, it was becoming a monster. television and radio became the tool to manipulate. And looking back through my childhood, the impact it would have on my generation was profound. And for many, profoundly bad. Books at the time, Starship Troopers, Psycho, and the James Bond 007 Goldfinger. The dollar had amazing power in 1959. It had the buying power of $8.35 of today's money. And looking back, I see that my generation was profoundly impacted. And I was impacted. So that becomes part of my story. Making this video challenged me. I couldn't get the thoughts right in my mind. Of course, the older I get, the harder that is. I'm having a hard time getting things from my mind out of my mouth. That has a lot to do with my heart disease, and I've had some brain injuries. Okay, let the jokes fly. I mean, yeah, it's funny. Guys saying I got brain injuries. Well, it's true. When I was a small child, my mother took me to the Downey Plunge to learn how to swim. Towards the end of the summer, I was doing pretty good. And I remember the day. I could barely hold on to the edge, and when I'd let go, I'd flap around the water, and the lifeguards. I looked up to the lifeguards, and I looked at one of the lifeguards, and I said, "Hey, throw the rope to me." They were getting ready to throw the rope across the pool. And so the guy took it, he wound up and he flung it way up high in the air, and I watched it go, and it came down and it hit me right here. Big metal hook, that big, hit me right here. And back then, all they knew to do was put in some stitches. They didn't do x-rays, they didn't have brain scans or anything like that back then. So that was my first major head trauma. From there on, I would have lots of head traumas. I played football, 5 years of using my head to hit people. Now that's stupid. There's a rule now, you can't use heads. I didn't understand the dangers of head trauma, and I don't think the world did until about 10 years ago when professional athletes started having mental problems when they got older. Brain trauma affects you. If you've hit your head hard at one time, you may not see it when you're young, but when you're older, it'll catch up with you. So I feel a big rush to get this on videotape before I completely forget everything. You know, one thing I learned in life is that you can't know everything, but you can learn a lot about everything, and you're guaranteed to forget a lot of what you learned. This is an important truth that I want to share with you, because there are times in life where you have to be mentally on it, locked in. You have to be focused, you have to be determined, and you have to be passionate about what you're doing. My life seems like it's 4 or 5 movies where I play a different actor in each one. One thing I've had to do all my life is make order out of disorder. Think about that, order out of disorder. One thing you'll know about me is I'm a pacifist, but I don't look like one. I have never purposely reached out and hit anybody, except for my wife. The only person I've ever hit in my life was my wife, and I regret that so much. It defeated me so bad. We were in a very heavy argument one day, and we were still in our 20s, and I got so upset that I struck her. And as soon as I did, I felt like my whole world was ripped apart and that I lost everything. Not only did I disappoint myself, I disappointed God, and that bothered me. So all my life I've been a pacifist, except for that one day. It's one of the reasons why I didn't do too good in high school sports. Coach kept telling me that if you see a player that's injured, you hit him in that injury, take him out. I didn't like that. In fact, during practice, it was my friend on the other side of the line, and he had bad knees, and he kept telling me, he said, "Lou, don't hit me in my knees." And I'd go back and tell the coach, "Coach, look, I'm not going to hit him in the knees anymore." and the coach would get mad at me and yell at me. And he forced me back in. And the next play, I hit him in the knees again, and I hurt the kid so bad that the next day I quit football. Never played it again. I think it's a worthless, useless sport. 1, it causes brain trauma. 2, it causes injury. 3, it ruins lives. When I'm telling my life stories, I'm not bragging about the bad things I've done, and I'm not bragging about the good things I've done. I'm just trying to piece together a story for you so that you could understand how it all fits together. Because one thing I see about my life is that there's a definite plan for it. The good and the bad. There's something there fighting warring. And that warring goes on in my heart and it goes in my mind. And the warring is to be good, to be a good human, to believe in God, to have faith in God. Because God will see you through the problems of life. And God walked with me throughout my entire life and watched over me from a little child. In fact, I think that He had a plan for me before I was even out of the womb. Now, before you stick me on a cross and crucify me for my faith, hear my story out. Listen to what I've got to say. You may be a staunch non-believer in God, but that's okay. And I firmly believe that there is a war between good and evil. And I've got in and did my research. Now, one thing about a brain injury, it affects every single person differently. I did horrible in school because I was very, very, very bad at testing. I loved the subjects. I loved learning. I can actually apply myself and learn in school. But when it came down to the tests, I freaked out. My heart would race, my blood pressure would go up. I didn't know I had a heart disease. But just the pressure of having to take a test and the fear of not being able to pull those things out of my mind shut me down for school. All the way through school, I was a very poor student, and I came out of school pretty damn dumb. When a big event like a metal hook hits you in the head, or you're knocked out about 10 times within the first 15 years of your life, it shapes you. It makes you a different person. Now, on my father's side, my grandparents came from Norway. Economic times in Norway was very bad. And they came to Long Beach, California, where there was a big oil boom. And there was a beach life that was just incredible. I guess Grandpa was some type of a security guard. We don't have very many pictures from back then, and my grandmother died when my father went off to war. My dad had a lot of resentment towards his parents and didn't talk too much about them. In fact, my mother was raised in Boyle Heights, which is a suburb right off of Los Angeles. Then it used to be a nice city. Now it's Barrio. My grandfather, he had fought in World War II and in part of World War I. In World War I, he was gassed and he suffered health problems. And when he got older, he kept blaming his health problems on that. But to tell you the truth, when those guys came back, they were alcoholics. And when I was born, my grandfather had to be put into a Veterans Administration rehab facility. And I didn't know what it was then. They just kept telling me he was sick and getting better. But now that I look back, I realized that there were a lot of alcoholics that came out of the war, and the United States has addressed. And that was that was my grandfather's fact. At one time when he was Or when my mother, who was the oldest of 7 children, one time he lined them up all in front of the garage door and had a shotgun. He was going to shoot them all down, and then one of the neighbors saw what was going on and came and rescued the kids. But he was such a violent alcoholic. My mother told me stories about her having to hide under the bed in fear of him. And her job was always to protect the other children. That family would end up, I don't exactly know how that came out. I know that story, but I don't know the other things that went down during that time. The family wouldn't talk about it. It was a big shame on the family, and one they tried to hide from me. I guess my mom became a ward of the state at one time, and she had some pretty bad jobs. In fact, she told me she was in an old folks' home having to wipe butts. That's all she would say. You know, Mom and Dad, they just didn't tell me a lot about history and family. I had to go find a lot myself, and there are so many pieces that are missing. But the one thing I really find strange is that my mom married awful young. When she had me, she was 40. But she got married to a young pastor, and she was married to him for 17 years. And all she would tell me about him was that he was a very immoral person. He and his father, who was also a pastor, they were into pedophilia. She had caught them in many encounters. And I guess her husband at the time had illegitimate babies and was very sexually active. But in 17 years, my mom never got pregnant. She just figured that she couldn't have babies. And her life was miserable by a maniac church family that was running a church with smiles on the outside but evil thoughts on the inside. It burned my mom on religion so bad she wouldn't talk about God at all. She believed in God. How do I know she believed in God? Well, when I was getting ready to go to school, she put me in a private Christian school. So I went to a private Christian school growing up, and then I would come home to a family that didn't embrace Christianity. In fact, Mom, somewhere in her life, she met a woman who became her mentor and helped her get into, believe it or not, showing dogs. Yeah, showing dogs. You know, they have dog shows. They judge the dog for the standards, the trimming. They got handlers that walk them out around the ring. Back in the 50s, this was huge in Southern California and huge in the United States. In fact, back in the 50s, dog handling was the big Hollywood thing to do. If you had money in Hollywood, you bought a dog and then you hired a handler to take him into the dog ring and show him. And if your dog could, and you got the right handler and your dog was successful, it was big money because they would charge stud fees. And other people wanted to have carbon copies of the dog that went first place. So it is a big racket and big money and big names in Hollywood. That's what my mom was doing when she met my dad. She was a professional. Well, she was getting to be a professional dog handler. And that's why we lived on the side of a cow pasture, is because that's where they had their dog kennel. So I grew up in a dog kennel. Woof. Yeah, yep. The dog business was 24 hours a day. In the morning they would get up and they'd have to put all the dogs out. Now these dogs belonged to other people, they weren't their dogs. And at any one time we would have anywhere between 20 and 30 dogs in the kennel at one time. So my mom was a very busy woman and she didn't have time for kids. So I was left with sitters, and they would hire people to come take care of me. In fact, here's a little video of me in the backyard taken by a babysitter, and I don't know who this lady was. That was a cute little guy, wasn't he? Still looked the same. Look at that. But nonetheless, it was life in a dog kennel. So I spent quite a few of my first formative years in the way of everybody. I was just in the way. And I get treated in that way too. In fact, my dad used to look at me and say, "Get out of here. Go do something. Get out of my way." And I grew up to resent my parents. They didn't spend time with me. They didn't nurture me. They didn't do anything. In fact, because my dad's family was poor, my dad was raised on the city streets of Long Beach. In fact, or the greatest story that he tells is of Rainbow Pier. I guess Rainbow Pier was quite an achievement back in his day. But because my dad was left to run the streets when he was young, he did the same with me. And I was allowed to go anywhere and do anything, and that's why I had to take care of myself. Yeah. Now that sounds extreme, doesn't it? But no, I literally grew up a street life. Going to a private school, filled with all this goodness, and at home, all this moral badness. So both my mom and dad, they never had really good parental roles. Back when my dad grew up in Long Beach, it was pretty safe on the streets. There wasn't pedophiles, there weren't gang members, and there wasn't bad drug epidemics. Kids were pretty much safe. And so my dad grew up in the streets of Long Beach, watching them build Rainbow Pier, hanging around the pike, and pretty much watching the ocean. Now my mom, she grew up in Boyle Heights. Her dad was a bad alcoholic. So neither one of their parents were really good parents. And when it came to raising me, they didn't know what it was to be a good parent either. And so at a very young age, I ended up having to fend for myself and be on my own. And I lived a lot of life on the street with a bed to come home to. When my parents brought me home from the hospital, they had no clue on how to raise a baby. They had both been in previous marriages, but my mother never had a baby, and my father did. Somewhere I got a half sister. When both of my parents met, they were very career-oriented people. They had a very strong work ethic. In fact, that's all they did, was work. My dad carried on a job, 40 to 60 hours of hard work every week, and then would come home to help my mom feed the dogs, put the dogs to bed, clean the kennel, and then he would sit down to have a drink, some dinner, and he'd usually be asleep in his chair at about 8:30. And this was every single day. On Friday nights, he would come home, he would pack up the van or the motorhome full of dog crates, all the supplies we needed, and put the dogs in, and we would bundle up the family and take off for dog shows where we would spend the whole weekend. So my dad pretty much worked 7 days a week, and he worked some major hours. Here's how tough my dad was. It was a totally different breed of guy. The men of America used to be really strong men. He would work all those hours, and he'd put in overtime. He was a boiler mechanic at a gasoline plant on Signal Hill, which is in Long Beach where he grew up. And he worked there for 40 years, and the last day he worked, he came home, and I met him at the curb, and I congratulated him. I said, hey, congratulations. 40 years for the same company, and now you've retired. And he looked at me and said, yeah. But he had worked for that company for 40 years, and when he came home, I met him at the curb, and he handed me his lunchbox, which looked brand new. And he says, here, give this to your kids. Maybe they put their cars in it or something. And I said, well, that's your lunchbox. And he says, he looks at it and says, yeah, I carried that every day. He says, all it did was sit on the seat of my car, sat in my locker. I would eat, put it back. And he looks at the lunchbox and he says, yeah, here, why don't you give this to your kids? And I said, well, Dad, aren't you going to need your lunchbox? And he says, no. And then he looks at it and he says, I bought that lunchbox 40 years ago. And I looked at it and I said, it looks brand new. And he says, well, all it did was go onto the seat of my truck, into my locker, and back on the seat of my truck and home every day. And I said, well, not every day. There was days that you were sick, right? He says, no, I never took a sick day. And I said, well, there were days that you went out for a hamburger with the other guys, right? He goes, nope. I took my lunch every single day. See, that was a whole different type of people back then. They knew what it was like to do without. I remember one of the first things my dad did when he retired was buy bicycles. And I said, why are you buying bicycles? You don't ride bikes. And he says, well, that's the only way to get around during war. And I said, what do you mean the only way to get around? And he says, well, there won't be car tires available. He says that all goes, he says factories turn all towards the war. And I said, so really? So you're buying bikes so you could get around and for the rubber tires? And he says, yeah. That took me a long time to wrap my head around that. Think about it. If your country goes to war, what things wouldn't you have anymore? I mean, when you're in a serious world war, you're defending your country. Right now, Trump is talking about war with North Korea. And granted, if the information's right about the North Koreans wanting to nuke us, then we got to do something about it. But America, a world war is not what you want. You don't want the world at war. It makes life so hard, and these people struggled so bad, and those were the only real stories that they would tell. They would tell their stories about war, but they wouldn't tell the stories or the truth about themselves. So that's one of the things that I want to do on this video, is I want to tell the truth about myself and the truth about them, and I want to pass that on. And if you could get anything out of these videos, I hope you do. And I gotta keep talking. I gotta keep trying. I think one of the biggest things that I've struggled with the past few days is trying to entertain you and trying to tell my story at the same time. Because the last thing you want to do is watch a video that's boring as hell. And I don't want my video to be boring. So I got you some nice background. Look at that. I think that's right there. Guy's fishing, right? Yeah, guy's fishing. That's another thing I don't have to do anymore is fish. That's all my parents wanted to do was fish. They did really good at being professional dog handlers. In fact, in 1970, my mother was voted the best female dog handler in North America. That's a pretty high accomplishment. I was proud of my mother and father. I still am. But they didn't know squat about raising kids. The only thing they did right was put me into that private Christian school, because it was in that private Christian school that I would end up going to school and being taught alongside the family of one of the most prominent pastors in Southern California, Dr. David Cartahure. So when I was in school learning and being taught, I was learning the things he wanted to teach his children. See, he was the president of our school, and he made sure that the curriculum was good curriculum and we were taught right. So the things I learned as a child and on into adulthood were things that my mother wanted to instill in me, but she couldn't. How do you tell somebody about God and how God can make your life better when you have a husband that's running around popping out kids all over the place and you can't have any yourself? And I guess their stories were so bad, and some of the things that they did, they didn't talk about it. They hid them. And that's the way the generations were in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Family problems got shh. Abortions, shh. Elective surgeries, there were none. But they didn't talk about things back then. And when it came to religion and God, they didn't talk about it. So when I was in school, they learned me. They taught me to start talking about it and to be real with it and to do research. I've got an opportunity to do an amazing amount of research. Okay, now, to just give you a brief rundown on me, who I am. Let's see. I was born on the side of a cow pasture. I was born in a very rough neighborhood with a bunch of very rough children who grew into very rough adults, which I was a rough adult. I went to a private school, so I had this war going on with me. The things I would learn at school, the good things, and how to be good, I'd come home, and everybody was the opposite. You know, the kids at school would go to church. I didn't go to church. My family wouldn't go to church. I wanted to go to church. The kids at school were good upbringing. They had things and parents involved in their life. My parents weren't involved in my life. In fact, they told me to get out of their way. So I would spend most of my hours on the street, out playing with the kids, or getting into trouble, or doing whatever I just needed to do to survive. And man, I went through a lot. Now, when I was 13, my dad brought me a brand new bike, but he had a reason for buying it for me. He wanted me to have a paper route. So I went and I had a paper route. I'd get up at 5 in the morning, go out, wrap up the papers, then ride around the neighborhoods and throw papers. I hated that job. I didn't like it, but my dad told me that I had to work for my money. So I had a paper route. I don't know what I did with the money. My second job was at I wanted a car. My dad says, you got a bike. And I said, well, I want a car. And he says, well, you got a bike. And I said, yeah, but I want a car. And he says, you need to go get a job. So I went to work at Big John's Submarine Sandwiches in Bellflower, making sandwiches, and my dad loved it because I would steal lunch meat. They'd let us make a sandwich on the way to take home. I would leave it about that thick with lunch meat and take it home and put it in the refrigerator, and we'd just deconstruct it and use lunch meat, my dad's lunch. Was that right to do? No, it wasn't right. Right here, I'm gonna leave you right here. Life's tough. I mean, we've really got to work hard at it. Kids need help. They need guidance. We don't need evil, we don't need corruption, we don't need bad things going on. We don't need to have corrupt communication coming out of our mouth or into our ears. We need to guard our hearts so that we're not mean people, but we could be good humans. Because that's what God intended for us all, is to be good humans. It was only the good humans in my life that helped me come out and be the man I am today. And there's more stories coming on Lurinator 59, and some of them are going to be real good ones. Because now that I can start talking about myself, I'm going to share some real good ones. So, hang tough. I'll be back. Hey. Love. Love, peace, joy, kindness, goodness, gentleness, mercy. There's no laws against those.